There's a moment most people don't talk about. It doesn't happen at work, it doesn't happen in conversation. It happens when things finally get quiet. You look at your life, your career, your effort, your sacrifices, and a thought surfaces that feels almost disloyal. Was this really what all that was for? Because you didn't wing it, you didn't cut corners, you showed up, you played by the rules, you kept going when quitting would have been easier. And for a long time, the system rewarded you, just enough to keep you believing. Then something shifted. Not all at once, but undeniably. The layoffs, they didn't make sense. Loyalty stopped counting. Experience became expensive. And slowly a realization crept in that most people never say out loud. The deal we thought we were making changed, and no one told us. Over the past few years, I've spent my time watching what actually happens to people who did everything right and still ended up disoriented. And what becomes clear is this: we weren't just given bad advice, we were trained for a world that no longer exists. And unless you question that training, the second half of life can feel like confusion instead of clarity. So let's talk about the five biggest lies we were taught about work, success, and aging. Not to feel better about the past, but to see the present clearly. This lie didn't just shape behaviour, it trained people to comply without questioning. Work harder, stay later, be grateful. And it worked. Not because it was true, but because it kept people predictable. Here's what the research and lived experience now agree on: hard work makes you reliable, it makes you useful, it does not make you secure. If effort alone created safety, we wouldn't have watched entire teams just disappear overnight. We wouldn't have seen experience quietly reframed as an overhead. What actually drives outcome in modern work isn't effort, it's leverage, and leverage isn't evenly distributed. And most people are never taught how to build it. So if you've ever felt like you were doing everything right and still falling behind, that wasn't a personal failure, it was a design flaw. This one goes deeper than money. It goes after identity. We were encouraged subtly and constantly to merge who we are with what we do. Job titles became shorthand for worth. Status replaced substance. But here's the thing no one warned us about. When your identity is tied to a role, it collapses the moment the role disappears. That's why layoffs feel so disorienting. It's not just income that vanishes, it's orientation. People don't just ask, what do I do now? They ask, who am I now? And that question is terrifying if your sense of self was outsourced. The uncomfortable truth is this: work was never meant to carry our entire sense of identity. It was never designed to be a stand in for meaning, or purpose, or worth. But we let it because we were never shown another model. This lie did real damage. It turns normal uncertainty into quiet shame. By 30, you were supposed to be set. Anything else felt like falling behind. But that expectation came from a world where careers were stable, linear, and predictable. But that world has gone. What replaced it is volatility: technological, economical, and cultural. The world changed, but the expectations, well, they never did. So people blame themselves for failing to meet a standard that was never designed for this reality. What research consistently shows is that modern lives don't progress in straight lines. They stall, they reset, they reroute. That isn't dysfunction. That's what adaptation actually looks like. The real value wasn't changing direction, it was believing you weren't allowed to. This lie is useful, which is why it's repeated. A fearful population is easier to sell to, easier to replace, and easier to dismiss. But aging doesn't erase value, it changes where that value comes from. Youth brings speed, but age brings pattern recognition. Youth reacts, age anticipates. By midlife, you've seen enough cycles to recognise the signs early. You know which meetings matter, which arguments aren't worth having, and which opportunities are just noise. That isn't slowing down, that's efficiency. But it only becomes an advantage if you stop trying to prove you're still young and start using what you've actually earned. This lie kept people running. There was always a next marker: a higher title, a bigger number, and just enough progress to keep the chase alive. But success was never supposed to be a finish line. That idea came from factories and systems, not from how people actually work. What research keeps circling back to is something much quieter: People feel fulfilled when their work aligns with their values now, not when they finally arrive somewhere. The tragedy isn't missing the destination, it's realising you've outgrown the goal and still feeling forced to chase it anyway. So if something in this made you uncomfortable, that's not a problem. That's awareness. Awareness that the rules you followed were incomplete. Awareness that effort, loyalty, and patience were never the whole equation. An awareness that the second half of life doesn't have to be about proving anything. It can be about seeing clearly, maybe for the first time. And clarity doesn't fix everything. It doesn't give you answers overnight, but it does give you something quieter. It changes what you stop blaming yourself for. It lets you see that confusion wasn't a personal failure. It was a mismatch between who you became and a system that never updated. And once you see that, you start noticing it everywhere in conversations, in meetings, in the stories that people tell themselves. And that's where the real shift begins.